767, about 7:58, and it was in the air for about 50 minutes when it impacted with the 96th floor of the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Much more attention was being devoted to the Twin Towers at this point in time, so there's a lot of footage of the impact with the South Tower. Here we see the plane approaching the South Tower as the North Tower is in flames. Here's the plane coming forward. This was United 175, also out of Boston's Logan Airport, another 767. It took off at 8:14 and impacted with the 80th floor at about 9:03. Interestingly, its amount of time in flight was about almost identical with that of a flight, American Airlines 11, about 50 minutes in the air. Here's this tremendous impact and the explosion and the fireball. And what you want to appreciate is that a tremendous amount of the fuel that was aboard the aircraft was burned off in these fireballs within the first minute or two. A tremendous amount of the fuel that was aboard the aircraft was burned off. So the amount that remained was not so extensive. It turns out that the steel used in these buildings was certified by Underwriters Laboratory to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 6 hours. 6 hours. The highest temperature at which kerosene based jet fuel can burn under optimal conditions is around 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Underwriters Laboratory actually estimated that because of the insulation and so forth in the building, that it was far more likely that the steel itself was never heated much above around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which of course is obviously far too low to accommodate the melting of the steel. The highest temperatures that were measured in the South Tower were around 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, but still way, way below what would have been required. Now, what's interesting about the fall of the buildings is the order in which they fell. The South Tower fell at 10 a.m., actually 9:59, after only 56 minutes from impact. So it was only 56 minutes of exposure at temperatures that were far too low to actually melt steel before the building came down. The North Tower, however, was exposed for 1 hour and 37 minutes. So it's very curious that the building which was exposed to these fires, which are alleged to be the cause of the collapse of the building, fell in the wrong order. They fell in the wrong order. If it was actually the heat from the fires that is supposed to precipitate their falling, then the North Tower, which was hit first, should have fallen first. But it was the South Tower, which was hit second, that fell first. There are many indications of the nature of the collapse that are rather stunning. There's a tremendous amount of steel girders that are thrown outwards. You can see a lot of them here in the dust and debris cloud. The way in which the buildings fell was quite stunning because they fell into their own footprint. This is rather remarkable on several counts, considering that vastly more damage would have been done to lower Manhattan if these 110-story buildings had fallen somehow askew and onto other buildings. They not only fell into their own footprint, but they fell in such a way that most of the steel was in 30-foot segments, which made it very easy to load aboard vehicles, and most of the steel was in fact very promptly removed by an extremely efficient company by the name of Controlled Demolition. Now here's further indication of what's going on, and it is stunning how the massive concrete, there's a huge quantity of concrete here, was pulverized, turned into very fine powder. Now, if these buildings had come down, as the government contends, by virtue of this pancake effect, there should have been a tremendous pile, a residue of concrete chunks, concrete boulders and all that. No such was found. In fact, this concrete was turned into very fine dust, which required a tremendous amount of greater amount of explosives than the energy that would have been released by the pancaking effect of the building. Moreover, and this is quite stunning too, the rate at which the buildings fell is perhaps most remarkable. I mentioned Galileo's law of free fall. If you had dropped, say, a billiard ball from the top of the World Trade Center, 110 floors up there, it would have taken 8 to 10 seconds to hit the ground, encountering no resistance whatsoever. There is no scenario for a pancake effect of buildings falling that allows them to fall at the rate of free fall. if you were just to surmise, hypothetically as an approximation, that they would take a second for each floor to collapse, and if you were talking about the whole 110 floors, that would represent 110 seconds, or 100 seconds too many. If you assume that, well, yeah, but the one hit on the 96th floor, so we're only talking about collapse from the 96th floor, that would still be 96 seconds if you're assuming a second per collapse per floor. Now, an engineer in California suggests that a second is too high, that it may have only taken a half a second in order for the mass, the weight of the upper floors to overcome the resistance of the lower floors, and suggests that a half a second. Well, if you take a half a second into 96 floors, then you get 48 seconds it should have taken for the building to fall. Yet they only fell in 8 to 10 seconds, far too fast. Similarly, hitting the 80th floor of the other trade tower would have required 40 seconds if you at a half a second per floor. Far too fast for the 8 to 10 seconds that they fell. I mean, it's not even physically possible that the buildings could have fallen in accordance with the government's claim. Moreover, and although it doesn't show it here, but in other footage that you'll find on the video clips that I mentioned, there was a tremendous explosion in the sub-basements. These sub-basements run 7 and 8 floors below the ground. There was tremendous explosion in the sub-basements that was even recorded on seismographs run by Columbia University about 8 or 9 seconds before the building started to fall. About 8 or 9 seconds, that is to say, before the planes impacted with the buildings. The tremendous explosions in the sub-basement. I mean, it's really dramatic stuff.
Right in the basement, you felt it. Walls were caving in, everything that was going on. I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
And we have some workers who were there that were damaged by these sub-basement explosions, and talk about a 50-ton hydraulic press, for example, that was completely obliterated in the explosion. And if you look at the film footage of the explosions, you find all over the place there's these little plumes of smoke breaking out called spools that are symptomatic of a controlled demolition. Here's a spool, see how it extends. Here's another, see how it extends. Here's another, see how it extends. And we wound up with this mass of steel that was surprisingly easy to remove because so much of it was of a relatively uniform size, around 30-foot lengths, really quite remarkable. And they started cleaning up the site almost immediately. Now, the claim was made, and you can find this in the 9/11 Commission report, that the center of the buildings was all hollowed out. But the only part of the center of the buildings was all hollowed out were the actual elevator shafts. There were, in fact, 47 steel columns at the center of each of these buildings. 47 steel columns at the center of these buildings, and on the perimeter there were no less than 240 steel columns. And you certainly would have expected them to be projecting upward if the building had fallen. It would have been very asymmetrical. It would have been very different kind of collapse than occurred here. Here's some early photographs in the construction of these buildings. They were really marvels of engineering. These were brilliantly conceived buildings, and they were built in the full knowledge that it might be the case that they have to resist the impact of aircraft. Here is Frank DiMartini, who was the chief engineer on one of the towers, who reported that they were constructed in such a fashion and they were so resilient that the impact of the largest known commercial aircraft at the time, a Boeing 707, would be like sticking a pencil through mosquito netting.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
And I found 3 other engineers who played primary roles in the project who say the same thing. This guy, Frank DiMartini, was killed on 9/11 when the buildings collapsed. Here's a comparison of the Boeing 707 with the 767. They're very similar in their dimensions, in their maximum takeoff weight, maximum fuel capacity, cruise speeds, and the like. These are very similar aircraft. Let me mention, by the way, that this is the first and only time in history that any steel structure skyscrapers are ever collapsed due to fire. It has never before been recorded in the history of structural engineering, before or since. So government is asking us to believe that on this one day, 9/11, as it were, the laws of physics were suspended and phenomena never before known to structural engineering were taking place just in this exact location. Here is World Trade Center building number 7. This was a 47-story skyscraper, which if it hadn't been surrounded by 110-story buildings would have been regarded as quite a substantial building. This building fell at 5:25 p.m., never having been hit by any aircraft, and only having sustained 2 relatively small fires. And it was brought down by what we know was a controlled demolition. Because Larry Silverstein, who had leased the World Trade Center about 6 months before all these events took place and insured the buildings at quite a substantial chunk of money in the billions of dollars, for which he then collected twice by insisting it was 2 different attacks, had a conversation with somebody he described as the chief of police, where Silverstein reported he told the chief, well, there's been so much death and destruction, maybe the best thing we can do is pull it.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Where the term pulling, of course, in construction means take it down by controlled demolition. This building came down perfectly symmetrical, fell into its own footprint. Absolutely crystal clear that that is what happened to World Trade Center 7. The best that the 9/11 Commission could do was to say that the only scenario they had for its collapse was highly improbable. What that means is they couldn't explain it. What that means is if they did explain it, it would raise too many important questions about whether the other buildings, whose collapse was so very similar to the collapse of World Trade Center number 7, hadn't been from similar causes. In this case, notice, in order to pull the building, there had to be pre-positioned explosives. The building could not have been pulled unless there were pre-positioned explosives, which raises the very appropriate question, does that mean there could have been pre-positioned explosives in the World Trade Center? Well, there have been a lot of reports of oddities involving security in the weeks leading up to 9/11. The agency that responsible for its security is a company named Securicom. A director of the agency, which not only was responsible for security at the World Trade Center, but also at Dulles Airport and for United Airlines, was none other than Marvin Bush, the president's brother.
He's joining us now, the co-chairman of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota at Duluth, James Fetzer. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, is this a required course? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it a required course?
Well, you got your facts foxed, I'm sorry to say. In fact, I created an organization of faculty and experts to study 9/11, not to teach in courses.
Right.
But I must tell you what we have discovered.
Well, I just want to be clear, because
certainly qualify as material for an important course.
So you're saying you're not teaching this?
Teaching.
I want to be clear here. You're not teaching a course in this.
No, you're confused, and I hope that Fox usually does a better job on their research than this.
All right, so there
I created an organization of faculty and scholars to study 9/11.
All right, I want to be clear on this.
We've discovered that practically everything the government has told us about it is false.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a moment. I just want to be clear. So as far as you know, there is no course on 9/11 conspiracy theories being taught at your university or any place else that you know of?
That's right, but it's a great idea. I would certainly support having such a course because there's a lot of material to work with.
All right, and what evidence do you have that the government was involved, that Cheney knew, that anybody in the chain of command knew ahead of time that this was going to happen on 9/11? Can you give us any piece of evidence that would substantiate that argument?
Absolutely. For example, Norman Mineta testified to the 9/11 Commission that he observed Dick Cheney in an underground bunker when a young aide came up to him and repeatedly told him, sir, it's 50 miles out, sir, it's 30 miles, sir, it's 10 miles out, sir, do the orders still stand? Cheney turned around, jumped on him, nearly bit off his head and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything different? The order had to be to not shoot down the plane that was approaching the Pentagon. After all, the order should have been to shoot it down. Shooting it down would be the obvious thing to do when you consider that you're going to lose the passengers in the plane if you shoot it down, but if you don't, you're going to use the passengers in the plane and also, of course, all the personnel and property at the target.
Hey, Prof, let me ask you, how big is this group of professors that you've put together, this organization you've formed, that gives credence, if you will, to the theory you just advanced about 9/11?
Well, there are over 300 members, Colonel North, including about 200 with advanced research skills, and about 85 that have affiliations, including physicists, mechanical engineers, pilots, aeronautical engineers.
Sure.
We've discovered that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition. We've discovered that the Osama bin Laden appears to have had nothing to do with
Prof, help me out here. Having been involved in a couple of controversial undertakings over my years in government service, how many people in the government were part of this conspiracy that you envision? Hundreds, thousands?
No, Ollie. I think it's a small number. You know about classified, controlled operations where everything's compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Do you know, Ollie, that the FBI has confirmed that they have no hard evidence relating Osama bin Laden to the events of 9/11? Are you aware of that?
Well, Osama bin Laden himself claims that. I mean, they didn't manufacture those tapes.
This is the FBI, Ollie. This is the FBI that has affirmed in the last couple of weeks they have no hard evidence tying Osama bin Laden to 9/11.
And so all of these people that died on 9/11 were, as you're articulating, died as a consequence of what our government did.
We're trying to find out exactly what happened. Our government has a considerable reputation for telling things that are not true,
All right,
Ollie.
Professor, we thank you very much for coming on tonight.
Thursday night, I was invited on to Hannity and Combs ostensibly to discuss the results of investigations conducted by Scholars for 9/11 Truth. When I got on the show, however, I discovered that instead of wanting to address the rather crucial results, such as we have been discussing here, including that we had established that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition, which I said, including that we had Norman Minetta's testimony that Dick Cheney had given a stand-down order not to shoot the plane approaching the Pentagon, which we had, including that the FBI in recent weeks had affirmed it has no hard evidence connecting Osama bin Laden to 9/11, which I said they were more interested in whether I had discussed any of these questions with my students than whether what I was telling them was true.
And the first time I saw Building 7 come down straight and fast, I realized this is very curious. I hadn't seen it until just about, it's been about a year and a half now ago. And as soon as I saw it, in a sense, I was hooked. I figured, as a scientist, I can't just ignore this data. I could see that building come straight down. I'd seen demolitions before, controlled demolitions. They look just like that. A kink in the middle, and then that building just comes straight down, almost at free fall speed. Yeah. And pretty quick, I'm learning about molten metal pools under both towers after they collapsed, and Building 7. Now, Building 7 wasn't even hit by a jet, and yet it comes down, and then it's got this molten metal underneath. And where'd that come from? I have a sample of this molten metal. Previously, molten metal here. Just a tiny sample. This is really all we need. I brought along with me at the last minute. I thought, well, I'll throw that in. And by analyzing this, we determined it is not molten aluminum from the plane. Okay. Indeed, it contains a great deal of iron, which is the product of the thermite reaction. Now, thermite can be purchased on eBay, and many people, I show it in my class, physics, and I'll be showing it this fall in my physical science class. It's commonly shown. It's a very brilliant reaction. You get this white flare, this white dust, which is aluminum oxide coming off, and then this yellow hot molten metal, just white yellow hot, flowing out of this reaction. Now this thermite is so hot, this molten iron, especially when you mix sulfur in, now it's called thermate, and it'll just cut through steel, through structural steel, for example, like a knife through butter. And we also see this molten, yellow-hot molten metal with white wispy ash pouring out of the South Tower just minutes before its collapse. And I've shown this video, and it's just amazing. The photographs of that, it's in the NIST report, and the evidence is just piling up. This is, it has the characteristics, not of molten aluminum and not of molten, it's not just structural steel that somehow melted, no. It's very little chromium. But it does have sulfur and manganese and some other elements that are characteristic, you see. It's like a fingerprint that the criminal left behind. This carries with it evidence. How was this done? What was used? This chain of events leads me to reluctantly conclude that indeed there does seem to be insider. In other words, not just the hijacked planes, but also others involved setting these thermite cutter charges in the World Trade Center to bring them down. This, again, leads to the conclusion that our Constitution, which is our heritage as Americans, I love my country, I love the Constitution and the people in America. I'm afraid that our Constitution is literally hanging by a thread at this stage.
Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. It is unprecedented that I would get email about a For the Record program before the program even aired. But that was the case in the 24 hours before we taped this show Friday afternoon, as I received several emails of both support and outrage from people who had simply heard Kevin Barrett was to be my guest. Such is the passion generated by Mr. Barrett's views on the events of September 11th, 2001. The most recent event of which I'm aware is the resolution signed by 61 state legislators calling for the UW to fire Mr. Barrett. Kevin Barrett is my guest this morning. Mr. Barrett, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, it's good to be with you, Neil.
My question is, shouldn't it be simple enough to provide the evidence that would support the claims of the government? I mean, there should be plenty of physical evidence, shouldn't there?
Well, it depends which claims you're talking about. Personally, I think that the real core of the whole 9/11 question is the issue of whether the 3 World Trade Center buildings were demolished with explosives or whether they fell down for some other reason, such as being damaged by plane crashes or fires. And I think that at this point, the evidence is in. Anybody who's kept up on, with the critique of the official story in this area knows that at this point, the evidence just, is very convincing that all 3 buildings were taken down with explosives and controlled demolitions. For the government to try to disprove that at this point, or to try to support its case, I think would be very difficult because, they hid all the evidence. They prevented any kind of forensic investigation. All the steel was shipped off as fast as possible to China and melted down for scrap, so it was impossible to test the steel for signs of explosives. Fortunately, some remains, and Professor Stephen Jones has gotten his hands on multiple sources worth of steel, and he's run tests and he's found traces of thermate, an enhanced version of thermite, which is an explosive device that can take out steel, cut right through it like a knife through butter. I think that at this point, no rational person who looks at the evidence can argue against the proposition that the 3 World Trade Center buildings, the Twin Towers and WTC-7 especially, were taken down in controlled demolitions. That, I think, is by now proven beyond a reasonable doubt, as David Griffin has said, and as everybody who's looked into it, I think, from a fair-minded perspective, agrees.
Are you worried that you're shortchanging your own career, that that you will have difficulty pursuing your chosen field by virtue of the controversy?
I think what I'm doing is angling on the long term. In the short term, I may have some problems. It might be a little harder to get rehired next semester. Maybe not, though. I think a lot sooner than most people realize 9/11 is going to blow wide open. The official report doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's very simple. Any trained academic, anybody with any critical thinking skills at all, can read the official report and read David Ray Griffin's refutation, and the report just falls to shreds. Now, anybody who's willing to live with that report as the official record of the most important event of our century has no business calling themselves an intellectual or a teacher or anything. I mean, it's that obvious.
A.J. Hammer live in New York City.
And I'm Brooke Anderson live in Hollywood. AJ, it's been incredible. Pretty hard to believe, actually, the response we got today to the incredible story Showbiz Tonight broke last night. Actor Charlie Sheen's startling claims that the government may be covering up what really happened on September 11th.
So many emails coming in. We've been really overwhelmed today. Between the emails, the blogs, the websites, everybody is writing and talking about it. Charlie Sheen made the comments during a hard-to-believe interview on a radio show. And don't move, because in just a moment, the host of the radio show, the guy